Mara had not slept in 3 days, not since Victor slid the envelope across the kitchen table and told her to open it, not since she unfolded the single sheet of paper inside and read the words that made her stomach drop to the floor, not since she looked up at the man she had been forced to call a stepfather for 7 years and realized, with complete clarity, that he had never once thought of her as a person. She was 22 years old. She had a small job at a printing shop in the city. She had a mother lying sick in a hospital bed 2 floors above where she now sat. She had $43 in her bank account and a pair of shoes with a hole in the left sole. She had none of the things a person needed to fight back against someone like Victor Caldwell. Victor was not a violent man. That was the strangest part. He never raised his voice above a certain calm, measured tone. He dressed well. He smiled at the right moments. He knew exactly how to appear reasonable in every situation, which made him far more dangerous than any man who simply shouted and broke things. Shouting men could be reported. Victor could not be reported. No one would believe her. He had made sure of that over the years, quietly and methodically, the way a man tends a garden he plans to harvest someday. The paper in Mara's hands was a registration document. The organization listed at the top was one she had never heard of. The language was formal and old, full of terms she did not fully understand, but the core of it was plain enough. Her name had been entered into something called the Vein Market. There was a date, 3 days from then. There was an address in Vienna. There was a section at the bottom where Victor had already signed his name in blue ink, neat and unhurried, as though he had been planning this for a long time. She asked him what it meant. He told her, without changing his expression, that it was a financial arrangement, that their situation had become difficult, that her mother's medical bills had created a debt that ordinary means could not resolve, that Mara had an unusual quality about her, a quality that certain individuals were willing to compensate generously for, and that this was simply a business decision made under difficult circumstances. She stared at him. She waited for some sign that he was joking, or testing her, or that this was some terrible misunderstanding she had not yet grasped. There was no such sign. His eyes were calm. His hands were folded on the table. He had already made his peace with this decision, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Mara stood up from the table. She walked to her room. She locked the door, which she had never done before, because there had never been a reason. She sat on the edge of her bed, in the dark, and tried to think. Her mother's name was Elaine. Elaine Voss, who had once been the kind of woman who hummed while she cooked, and kept a small pot of herbs on the kitchen windowsill. Elaine, who had made the decision to marry Victor 9 years ago because she was afraid of being alone, and because Victor had been charming enough in those early months to seem like a solution to her problems. Elaine, who had spent the years since that decision growing quieter and smaller, while Victor grew more comfortable and more certain of his authority over everything around him. Elaine did not know what Victor had done. Mara was sure of that. Whatever her mother's failings had been over the years, whatever the silences and the looking away, Elaine would not have agreed to this. But Elaine was in the hospital. She had been there for 6 weeks, struggling with a condition that the doctors described carefully and at length, but that came down, in simple terms, to her body slowly failing her. She could not be burdened with this. Mara could not walk into that hospital room and tell her mother what her husband had done. That was the trap Victor had built. He had waited until Elaine was unavailable, until Mara was isolated, until the debts were real enough that any outsider would find it complicated. He had built this trap over years, one small piece at a time, and Mara had not seen it coming because she had been too focused on surviving the smaller indignities to notice the larger structure being assembled around her. She spent those 3 days trying to find a way out. She called a friend named Clara, who worked at a legal aid office downtown. Clara listened carefully and then told her, gently but honestly, that the document Mara was describing did not sound like anything that existed in any legal framework Clara had access to. She said it sounded like something from a private organization operating outside normal law, which meant normal law could not easily intervene. She said she was sorry. She said she would keep looking. She called back twice with dead ends. Mara considered running. She had $43 and a broken left shoe, and no car, and a mother in the hospital. Running meant leaving Elaine behind in a room where Victor was the only person with legal authority to make decisions. Running meant Victor could do whatever he wanted, and no one would stop him, and Elaine would not even know why her daughter had disappeared. She considered going to the hospital and telling her mother everything. She sat with that option for an entire afternoon. She could see exactly how it would go. Elaine would be devastated. Elaine would be frightened. Elaine was already fighting to stay alive, and this news would pull resources from that fight. Victor would be informed, Victor would find a way to frame it, and then Victor would still put Mara in a car to Vienna because he had already signed the paper. On the third night, Victor knocked on her door and told her a car would arrive at 6 the following morning. He said she should pack only what was necessary. He said this in the same tone a person uses to remind someone of a dentist appointment. Mara did not answer him. She sat on her bed in the dark for a long time after his footsteps faded down the hall. She thought about her mother's face. She thought about Clara's apologetic voice on the phone. She thought about the $43 and the broken shoe. She thought about the registration document still sitting on the kitchen table, with Victor's neat blue signature at the bottom. She thought about the fact that no one was coming to help her. She had understood this truth in smaller ways her whole life, but she had never felt it quite so completely as she felt it now, sitting in the dark in a locked room that had never really protected her from anything. The lock was a comfort she had invented. The room was borrowed. The life she had been building, carefully and slowly, with her small job and her $43 and her quiet routines, was something she had constructed on top of ground that Victor owned. She did not cry. She had spent a great deal of her life deciding when crying was worth the energy, and she had decided, somewhere in her early teenage years, that crying in situations where nothing could be changed by it was a waste of resources. She needed her resources. What she felt instead was something colder and quieter than sadness. It was the particular feeling of a person who has finally seen the full shape of something that has been growing around them for a long time. It was not despair. It was closer to clarity. She packed a small bag. She put in the things that mattered most: a photograph of her mother from before Victor, a notebook she had kept for years, a small amount of cash she had hidden in the binding of an old book because some instinct had told her years ago to do exactly that. She put in her broken left shoe because it was the only pair she had. She set her alarm for 5:30. She lay down on top of the covers. She stared at the ceiling. The car arrived exactly when Victor said it would. Two men she had never seen before. Polite, professional, entirely unmoved by the fact that she had not chosen to be in their car. They drove for a very long time. She watched the city give way to highway, and highway give way to airport, and airport give way to an aircraft she had never been on before. And she thought about how strange it was that the worst thing that had ever happened to her was also the furthest she had ever traveled. Vienna, when they arrived, was cold and gray and older than anything she had ever seen. The streets were made of stone. The buildings had the weight of centuries in them. The car moved through the evening traffic with quiet efficiency and turned, eventually, onto a street that narrowed until it was barely wide enough for a single vehicle, and stopped in front of a building that looked like it had once been an opera house and had since been converted into something that no longer had a name on the door. The two men escorted her inside without speaking. The inside was warmer than the street, but not by much. There were chandeliers, but they were dimmed low. There were other people, dressed far better than she was, moving through the corridors with the ease of people who knew exactly where they were and had no concern about being there. None of them looked at her directly. One woman glanced at her, then looked away, the same way a person looks away from something they have already categorized. A woman in a dark suit approached her. The woman had silver hair and steady eyes, and she addressed Mara by her full name. She told her what the evening would consist of. She used words like presentation and assessment and placement. She did not use the word auction. She did not need to. The shape of the evening was perfectly clear without that word. Mara listened. She did not speak. The woman in the dark suit seemed neither surprised nor troubled by Mara's silence. She had done this before. This was her profession. They took her to a room where they gave her a dress that was not hers and told her to put it on. She put it on. She looked at herself in the mirror on the back of the door and thought that she looked like a person dressed for someone else's occasion, which was exactly what she was. They took her to a corridor that led to a pair of large doors. Behind the doors, she could hear voices, low and blended together, the sound of a crowd that was comfortable and unhurried. She thought about Victor's neat blue signature. She thought about her mother's face in the photograph she had packed. She thought about the fact that no one was coming. The doors opened. The voices quieted. The lights beyond the doorway were brighter than the corridor, and for a moment, She could not see anything clearly. And then her eyes adjusted, and she saw the room, and the people in it, and the faces turned toward her. She walked forward. She did not look down. She had decided, sometime in the car, or on the plane, or in the corridor outside, that whatever happened next, she would not look down. It was the only decision left to her, and she intended to keep it. The room was large, and old, and full. Every seat was taken. The faces watching her were varied in age and appearance, but uniform in one quality she could not immediately name. After a moment, she understood what it was. None of them blinked with the frequency she was used to. She stood at the front of the room. She kept her eyes level. She did not look for exits because there were none worth looking for. She breathed evenly and waited for whatever came next. And then the room went quiet in a different way. Not the quiet of attention, the quiet of something else entirely. She heard no door open. She heard no announcement. But every person in the room shifted, subtly and collectively, the way a field of grass shifts when the wind changes direction. And she knew without turning around that someone had entered the room behind her. She turned. He was standing at the far end of the room, near the back. He had not sat down. He showed no intention of sitting down. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing with no ornamentation, and he was looking directly at her. Not at the room, not at the proceedings, at her. He did not look curious. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had just confirmed something he already knew. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds before she understood that this was the most important moment of the evening, and possibly of her life, and that she had no idea yet which direction it would fall. The bidding started with a number that was higher than Mara had expected, which told her that someone in this room had done their research and arrived with a clear purpose. The woman in the dark suit stood at the front and managed the proceedings with the efficiency of someone who had conducted this kind of event many times before, her voice even, her phrasing neutral, her eyes moving from face to face with professional precision. Mara stood where she had been placed and kept her eyes forward. She had made a decision in the corridor before the doors opened, and she was holding to it. She would not look afraid. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear was the one thing she refused to give freely to the people in this room. Everything else had been taken without her permission. Fear, at least, she could withhold. The bids came in quickly at first, then more slowly as the number climbed. She could hear them, but she did not turn to look at who was speaking. The voices were varied, some older, some younger, some speaking with accents she recognized, and some she did not. What they shared was confidence. None of them sounded uncertain. None of them sounded like this was a difficult decision. She was thinking about her mother. Not in a desperate way, not with grief rising in her throat. She was thinking about her mother, the way a person thinks about a fixed point when everything around them is moving too fast. Elaine's face. The small pot of herbs on the windowsill that Elaine had kept alive for years, tending them every morning before she did anything else. The way Elaine had held Mara's hand when Mara was 11 and sick with a fever that lasted 4 days. The way that hand had felt, warm and certain, as though the hand itself was making a promise. The bidding slowed. 2 voices remained in the exchange, both of them steady and deliberate, both of them adding to the number, with the calm of people for whom the amount was not the concern. The woman in the dark suit acknowledged each bid with a slight tilt of her head. Then the room went still again. In that particular way it had gone still when he entered. The change came from the back of the room. Mara felt it before she heard it. A shift in the quality of the air. A collective intake of breath held just slightly too long. The man from the back of the room spoke. He said a number. Just a number. Nothing before it and nothing after it. His voice was not loud. It carried anyway, the way certain sounds carry, not because of volume, but because of weight. The number, he said, ended the contest immediately. The 2 voices that had been exchanging bids did not respond. The room did not respond. The woman in the dark suit was quiet for 3 full seconds before she acknowledged the bid, and those 3 seconds felt significant, as though she was giving the room time to understand what had just happened. No one countered. Mara understood enough about power to know that the silence was not about the money, it was about who had spoken. The people in this room, people who had arrived with vast resources and no hesitation, had all made the same calculation in the same moment and arrived at the same conclusion. The man at the back of the room was not someone they were willing to oppose. The woman in the dark suit announced the conclusion of the proceedings. She used formal language that meant nothing, and everything at the same time. She thanked the attendees. She dismissed the room with the efficiency of someone wrapping up a meeting that had gone slightly shorter than planned. People began to move. The crowd shifted and thinned. No one looked at Mara directly on their way out. That telling quality, the looking away, the same thing the woman in the corridor had done when Mara first arrived. She had been categorized, resolved, and was no longer an open question. The room was done with her. The woman in the dark suit approached her and told her she would be escorted to a car. She said it the same way she said everything, neutrally and without particular interest. She placed a light hand on Mara's elbow and guided her toward a side door. The side door led to a narrow corridor, and the corridor led to a set of stairs, and the stairs led down to a private entrance where a car waited in the cold. The woman opened the rear door and stepped back. Mara looked at the open door. She looked at the woman. She asked who the car belonged to. The woman said the name without any particular ceremony, as though it were a thing anyone would know. The name was Kalem Dragici. Mara did not know the name. She said nothing, and got into the car because there was no alternative that was better, and sometimes survival is simply a sequence of choosing the less terrible option until a better one appears. The car moved through Vienna's stone streets. She was alone in the back seat. The driver did not speak. The windows were tinted dark enough that the city outside was visible but muted, the lights of the buildings pressing through the glass like something seen underwater. She thought about what the woman in the dark suit had not said. She had not said where Mara was going. She had not said how long the journey would be. She had not said what would happen at the end of it. These were not oversights. Information was being managed the way it had been managed all evening, carefully, deliberately, given out in the specific amounts required, and no more. She pressed her fingers together in her lap. She breathed. She watched Vienna give way to motorway, and motorway give way to countryside, and countryside give way to mountain roads that climbed steadily upward, into dark that was different from city dark. Mountain dark was complete. It pressed against the windows without apology. She had been traveling for what felt like 2 hours, when the car turned off the main road onto a narrower one, and the narrow road curved through trees that were very old and very tall, and at the end of the trees, the headlights lit the front of a building that was enormous and stone and set into the side of a mountain as though it had grown there. It was not a hotel. It was not an office. It was a home in the ancient sense of the word, a place that had been built to last centuries and had succeeded, and the weight of all those centuries sat in its walls visibly, in the worn edges of the stone steps, and the dark wood of the great front door, and the ivy that had colonized the upper stories, so completely it seemed like part of the original design. The car stopped. The driver came around and opened her door. She stepped out into air that was cold and thin, and smelled of pine, and something else, something she could not name, something very old. A woman came down the front steps to meet her. This woman was not the woman in the dark suit. She was younger in appearance, though Mara had already begun to understand that appearance was not a reliable measure of age in this world. She had dark hair and a direct gaze, and she introduced herself as Rhea without offering a surname or an explanation of her role. Rhea showed her inside. The entrance hall was large enough to feel expansive without feeling empty, which was an architectural achievement that Mara registered distantly through the fog of exhaustion and adrenaline that had been running through her system for days. There were paintings on the walls and a staircase that curved upward, and doors that were closed. There was firelight from somewhere she could not see, its warmth reaching into the hall without the source being visible. Rhea took her up the staircase and down a corridor, and showed her to a room that was larger than any room Mara had slept in before. There was a bed and a wardrobe and a window that looked out onto the mountain. There was a door that led to a private bathroom. There were clothes in the wardrobe, in sizes that fit her, which meant someone had anticipated her arrival in careful detail. Rhea told her that dinner could be brought to the room if she preferred. She said it as a question, but made it clear with her tone that bringing the food to the room was a real option, not a polite gesture. She said that nothing was required of Mara tonight. She said it simply, without drama. Mara asked if there was a lock on the door. Rhea said yes, and that it locked from the inside, and produced a small key from her pocket and placed it on the table beside the door. Mara looked at the key for a moment. She picked it up. She asked where the owner of the house was. Rhea said that he was in the lower levels and that he would not disturb her. She asked when she would see him. Rhea said that was up to him, but that it would not be tonight. Mara nodded. She thanked Rhea, which surprised the other woman slightly, and Rhea nodded and left and pulled the door closed behind her. Mara turned the key in the lock. She stood in the center of the large room and looked around at the firelight coming from a grate in the far wall, at the mountain visible through the window, at the clothes in the open wardrobe. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She put her face in her hands. She did not cry. But she stayed like that for a long time, her face in her hands, breathing, feeling the full weight of the last 3 days pressing down on her at once, because she had held it off during every moment when holding it off was necessary, and now she was alone and locked in, and she had a key, and she could allow herself 60 seconds of simply feeling how heavy it all was. She counted the 60 seconds. Then she lifted her head. She straightened her back. She looked at the room, at the window, at the mountain in the dark beyond the glass. She was still alive. She was still thinking. Whatever this place was, and whatever the man named Kalem Dragici wanted from her, she had resources he did not know about yet. She had survived 7 years of Victor's patient, careful, invisible control. She had survived 3 days of knowing what was coming, and having no way to stop it. She had stood in that room in Vienna, and kept her eyes level, while people she had never met discussed her future. She was still thinking. That mattered. She got up and washed her face in the bathroom. She found food on a tray that had been placed inside the room at some point, without her noticing, which should have unsettled her, but somehow did not. She ate because she needed fuel. She changed into the clothes from the wardrobe because her own were worn through. She got into the bed and lay in the dark and listened to the silence of the mountain. She thought about what Racia had said. Nothing required of her tonight. Not nothing required of her, tonight. The word was precise. She fell asleep faster than she expected, which was what happened when a body finally ran out of the chemicals that had been keeping it alert through an impossible 72 hours. Sleep came like a door closing. In the morning, the mountain was extraordinary. She stood at the window and looked at it for a long time. She had never been in the mountains before. She had grown up in a city and spent her adult life in a different city, and the most natural landscape she had regularly seen was a park with 2 benches and a broken fountain. The mountain outside this window was not a park. It was not decorative. It was massive and indifferent and covered in trees that were dark green against gray rock and gray sky, and it made her feel very small in a way that was oddly clarifying rather than frightening. She heard a knock at her door. She opened it. Rhea was there, with coffee and information, which turned out to be the combination Mara needed most. The information was practical. The house had 41 rooms. Mara was free to use the library on the 2nd floor, the garden through the east wing, the kitchen, whenever she wanted. She was asked only to avoid the lower levels after dark. Rhea explained this rule simply, without drama, as a statement of fact rather than a warning. Mara asked why. Rhea said that the lower levels were where he spent most of his time, and that he preferred his time undisturbed. Mara nodded. She did not ask a follow-up question yet. She was filing the information away. She would ask follow-up questions later, when she had more of the picture. She spent the morning in the library. It was an extraordinary room, floor-to-ceiling shelves, the kind of library that belongs to a person who has had many lifetimes to fill it. There were books in languages she recognized and languages she did not. There were sections on history, on science, on law, on subjects she had no name for yet. There was a section near the back of the room that was devoted entirely to documents, bound collections of old paper, handled and rehandled until the edges were soft. She pulled one from the shelf. The paper inside was very old. She could tell from the texture and the quality of the printing. The language was archaic in places, but she could follow the broad shape of it. It seemed to be a legal agreement of some kind. She saw a date near the top that made her pause. She turned the page. She read more carefully. She put it back. She pulled another. Then another. By noon, she had read enough to understand that the library she was sitting in contained a legal history of a world she had not known existed 3 days ago. A world with its own laws, its own governing bodies, its own systems of property and contract and dispute. A world that had been operating alongside the one she grew up in for longer than the one she grew up in had existed. She was sitting in the middle of it, in a borrowed dress, with a key in her pocket and a notebook in her bag, and $43 that were probably in a different country from where she had started. She heard a sound behind her, not from the door, from deeper in the library. She turned. He was standing at the far end of the room, between two tall shelves, watching her. Not in a threatening way. In the way a person watches something they find unexpectedly interesting. He had the same quality he had in the room in Vienna, that absolute stillness, as though standing still was something he had practiced for so long it had become his natural state. He was looking at what she had in her hands, at the documents she had pulled from the shelves. She did not put them down. She did not step back. She held them, and looked at him, and waited. He said her name, Mara, not as a question, as a confirmation. She said yes. He said he had not expected her to find the archive section on her first morning. She said she had started at the back of the room and worked forward. Something changed in his expression. Not much. Enough. He said her name was a very old one in the context of this library. She said she was beginning to understand that. He looked at her for another moment. Then he asked if she would like him to explain what she was reading. He said it the way a person offers something they genuinely have available and are willing to give, not as a performance of politeness. She said yes. He crossed the room and sat down across from her. He did not rush. He looked at the documents she had selected and began to speak, and what he said changed everything she thought she understood about why she was here. The name Voss meant nothing to Mara in the way names in a family tree sometimes mean nothing when you have grown up without the context that gives them meaning. She knew it was her mother's family name. She knew her mother had kept it through marriage to Victor because Elaine had always insisted on that one small piece of continuity, which Mara had understood at the time simply as stubbornness, but now suspected was something closer to a warning she had never been in a position to decode. Calum told her the history without embellishment. He was not the kind of person who added texture to facts to make them easier to receive. He gave them plainly and let her process them at her own pace, which she found she appreciated more than she expected to. The Voss family had not always been ordinary. In the 17th century, a woman named Petra Voss had been the last of a line of human guardians attached to one of the oldest vampire bloodlines in Europe. The arrangement was not what Mara would have expected. It was not servitude. It was a covenant, a word Calum used carefully and precisely, which in the legal framework of the nocturnal courts meant something with teeth. A binding agreement made between two parties of equal standing, enforceable by the governing body, carrying rights and obligations on both sides. Petra Voss had entered the covenant with the head of the Dragici bloodline in 1683, formalizing an arrangement that had existed informally for generations before that. The Voss family would serve as guardians in the human world, protecting the interests of the Dragici line, in contexts where the vampires themselves could not easily operate. In exchange, the Dragici line offered protection, resources, and the guarantee that no member of the Voss family would ever be claimed, traded, or entered into any contract with any other supernatural party without the explicit consent of both families. That last clause was the one Calum stopped on. He said it again. No member of the Voss family would ever be claimed, traded, or entered into any contract with any other supernatural party without the explicit consent of both families. Mara looked at him. She said that Victor had entered her into the vein market without her consent, or the consent of anyone in this family. Calum said yes. She said that made what Victor had done a violation of the covenant. Calum said yes, and that it was more specific than that. Under nocturnal law, entering a covenant-protected individual into a market transaction without disclosure and consent constituted not merely a breach of the agreement, but an active offense against the party holding the protective rights, which meant the Dragici line had standing to intervene. She asked why he had been at the vein market at all. She had assumed it was coincidence, or proximity, or some other reason she had not yet identified. She had not assumed it was specific. He said it was not coincidence. He said he had been tracking the Voss lineage for decades. The family had been considered extinct after the Second World War, when the last known heir had been declared missing and presumed dead. He had maintained a monitoring protocol as a matter of legal responsibility, because the covenant did not expire with the death of the last heir, but rather entered a dormancy period that would end if a descendant was located. He had located Mara's existence 6 years ago through records that had become digitized and therefore searchable. He had been watching the situation since then, carefully and at a distance, waiting for a reason to act. Victor, Putting her into the vein market had been the reason. Mara sat with this for a long moment. She was working through several things at once. The first was the sheer scale of what she was hearing. The idea that her family had a history she had never been told about, that she herself had been part of a legal framework she had never known existed. The second was a question about Caleb's motives, because she was not naive, and she understood that people with power did not act without reasons, even when those reasons were framed as protection. She asked him why he had purchased her, instead of simply intervening to have her removed from the proceedings. He said that removing her from the proceedings would have required a legal challenge that could take months to resolve within nocturnal court procedures. The vein market operated under a separate set of rules that made it legally valid as long as the transaction was completed. A completed transaction could then be challenged, but that was a slower process. Purchasing her himself was faster and gave her a clearer legal status in the interim. She asked what that legal status was. He said it was complicated. Technically, under the transaction, she was his. But the covenant superseded the transaction, which meant the transaction itself was voidable, which meant that a successful legal challenge could nullify it entirely. In the meantime, she was in the most protected position available to her under nocturnal law, which was not the same as a good position, but was better than the alternatives. She asked if there were alternatives she should know about. He said there was one. If she chose not to invoke the covenant and not to challenge the transaction, Victor retained a claim to compensation, though not to her person, as the sale would stand on its own terms. She would legally be Caleb's property under nocturnal contract law until the covenant question was formally resolved. This was not acceptable to him, and he would fight it regardless, but her participation in the challenge would strengthen it considerably. She asked what her participation would involve. He said, standing before the nocturnal court and stating her position. She thought about this. She looked at the documents still in her hands. She thought about Petra Voss in 1683, signing her name to a covenant that was supposed to protect her family forever. She thought about how long forever actually was, and how easily it could be interrupted by a man with neat handwriting and calm eyes, and no particular concern for the people he was supposed to protect. She asked about Victor. Caleb's expression did not change, but something in his posture did, a small and precise shift that communicated something he was choosing not to say directly. He said that Victor would face consequences under nocturnal law for the covenant violation, regardless of the outcome of the main case. Those consequences would be administered by the court, and he had no reason to expect they would be lenient, as covenant violations were among the most serious offenses in nocturnal legal code. She asked about her mother. This was the question she had been holding back since the beginning of the conversation, saving it because it was the one she needed the most careful answer to. He said her mother was not part of the nocturnal framework, and therefore not subject to its jurisdiction in either direction. Victor had no power over Elaine in this context. The medical situation and the hospital and all the human elements of Elaine's life were unaffected by what happened here. She asked if he was certain. He said he was. He said it without hedging, which was the same quality she had appreciated about everything else he said. He did not soften things. He did not add reassurances he could not back up. When he said he was certain, she believed it was because he had checked. She put the documents down on the table between them. She looked at them. She looked at him. She asked how long the legal process would take. He said the nocturnal court would convene within 60 days of a formal challenge being filed. She would have time to prepare. She would have access to the library and to anyone in the house who could help her understand what she would face. He would ensure she had everything she needed. She asked if he had anyone in mind when he said anyone in the house. He said Rhea was an expert in covenant law. She had been for a very long time. Mara almost smiled. She stopped herself, because smiling in the middle of negotiating the terms of her own legal freedom felt like the wrong register. But she noted it. She noted that this house, which had looked like a destination she had been taken to against her will, was beginning to look more like a specific kind of resource. She spent the next several days in the library with Rhea, and what she learned there expanded everything she thought she understood. Rhea had a way of teaching that Mara had not encountered before. She did not present information hierarchically, starting with basics and moving toward complexity. She started with the thing that was most immediately relevant and built outward from there. which meant Mara never lost the thread of why she was learning what she was learning. It was efficient. Mara respected efficiency. The covenant, Rhea explained, was more nuanced than Calum had conveyed, not because he had misrepresented it, but because there were layers that required legal context to understand. The Voss-Drugici Covenant of 1683 was not a standard protection agreement. It had been negotiated by Petra Voss herself, who by all accounts had been an extraordinarily precise legal thinker for someone operating in a century that did not encourage such qualities in women. Petra had included a clause that Rhea called the dormancy exception, which stated that, in the event of the covenant entering dormancy, due to the apparent extinction of the Voss line, any surviving heir who came forward would have the right not merely to invoke the existing terms, but to renegotiate them. Mara made Rhea repeat that twice. Any surviving heir could renegotiate the terms. She asked what renegotiation would look like in practice. Rhea said it would look like standing before the full nocturnal court and proposing new terms, which the court would then evaluate and ratify or reject. The court would be conservative, she said. They did not like change, but a covenant invoked by a living heir carried significant legal authority, and the court would have difficulty refusing reasonable terms proposed by someone with that kind of standing. Mara thought about what reasonable terms might look like. She thought about this for a long time. She thought about it in the library and in the garden and in her room at night and during meals that Rhea sometimes joined her for, and during which they talked about other things, about Rhea's own history, about the structure of the nocturnal courts, about how decisions got made in a world that had been governing itself in parallel with the human world for more than 1,000 years. She thought about Victor. She thought about what he had done and how he had done it, and what it had cost him to see her as currency rather than as a person. She thought about the neat blue signature on the registration document. She thought about how calm he had been, how certain. She thought about certainty, about the specific kind of certainty that comes from having operated in a system long enough to believe the system will always protect you, because it always has. Victor was certain the system would protect him. He had filed through official channels. He had completed the transaction according to the rules. He expected the rules to stand. But Petra Voss had written a clause into a document in 1683 that Victor did not know existed, because Victor had researched Mara's bloodline for its value as currency, and had not read far enough into the legal history to find the part that was not about value. He had looked for what he could take. He had not looked for what could be taken back. On the 41st day after her arrival at the estate, Calum told her the court date had been set. He said it without particular ceremony, as he said most things, and he told her the date and asked if she was ready. She said she was working on it. He said he had seen the documents she had been pulling from the archive over the past 6 weeks. He said it with a quality she could not immediately name, something between observation and approval. She said that Rhea was a very good teacher. He said Rhea had been saying the same about her. She looked at him. She had been looking at him more carefully over the past weeks, in the way you look at something you are trying to understand. He was not what she had assumed he would be when she first saw him in Vienna. The assumption she had made then was based on what he represented in that room. Power exercised without explanation, certainty that bent an entire event around itself. That was real. She did not revise it. But it was not the full picture. He spent most of his time in the lower levels, as Rhea had said. On the occasions when she saw him, he was either in the library or moving through the house, with the efficiency of someone who had a clear sense of what needed doing. He did not perform. He did not explain himself unless asked. When she asked him things directly, he answered directly, which was the quality she had come to rely on most heavily. She asked him once, about 3 weeks in, why he had attended the Vane market himself, rather than sending someone on his behalf. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had wanted to be certain. She asked certain of what? He said certain that the heir was real, and that she was who the records suggested she was, and that the situation was as serious as it appeared. He said he did not delegate decisions that significant. She looked at him. She thought about the moment in Vienna, when he had looked at her across the room, that single, unhurried glance before he raised 2 fingers and said a number that ended the evening. She asked if he had made his decision before or after he looked at her. He looked at her now. He said before. He had made the decision the moment he walked in and confirmed she was there. The look was not a decision. It was something else. She asked what? He said he was not yet certain how to answer that. She filed it. She had become very good at filing things she did not yet have a place for. On the night before the court date, she sat in the library alone for a long time. She had the covenant documents spread across the table. She had notes in her notebook, organized in a system that made sense to her, with the key points marked and the specific clauses she intended to reference, and the order in which she intended to present them. She thought about Petra Voss, who had sat somewhere in 1683 and written a clause that was still active 343 years later. She thought about the kind of foresight that required, the ability to see past the immediate situation, past the specific problem being solved, to the much larger problem that the specific problem was part of. The much larger problem was not the agreement between two parties. The much larger problem was who those parties were, and whether the agreement between them respected what both of them were. She thought about Victor, who would be in that courtroom tomorrow, with lawyers she had never met, and documents she had not seen, and 300 years of legal precedent on his side, or so he believed. She closed her notebook. She straightened the documents. She was ready. Not in the way a person is ready when they have been completely prepared and have no doubts. In the way a person is ready when they have done every reasonable thing available to them and have made peace with the fact that the rest is not in their control. She turned off the library light. In the morning, she dressed without ceremony, in clothes she had chosen herself from the wardrobe, the plainest ones available, because she had decided she did not want to look like she was performing for the court. She wanted to look like herself. It was a small decision, and also a significant one. Rhea walked with her to the car. Calum was already there. He looked at her when she came down the steps, and he said nothing, which she had come to understand was not indifference, but respect. He opened the car door. She got in. The drive to the court building took an hour. It was a different building from the opera house in Vienna, older even, set in a city she did not recognize. Inside, the corridors were high and stone and cold in the way that buildings are cold when they have held very old things for a very long time. She could hear voices ahead, the courtroom. She thought about her mother's face. She walked forward. The courtroom was different from anything Mara had imagined. She had constructed a mental image over the past weeks, based on what she had read in the library, drawing on descriptions in the legal histories Rhea had walked her through. The reality confirmed some of what she had imagined, and contradicted most of it. The room was large, the ceiling was very high. The lighting was not harsh, but it was thorough, reaching into every corner without creating the dramatic shadows she had half expected from a building of this age. The gallery was full, not noisily full, but deeply full, the kind of fullness that comes from people who have gathered because something significant is about to happen, and they intend to see it. The court itself was arranged differently from a human courtroom. There was no single judge. There were 9 of them, seated in a curved formation at the raised front of the room, each wearing the same dark formal attire, each presenting the same quality of absolute stillness that she had come to understand was not a performance but a baseline. Victor was already there. He was seated at a table to the left, flanked by 2 lawyers she did not recognize, and a third person she did not recognize either, someone who was reviewing documents with the intensity of a person who had been reviewing them all morning. Victor was dressed in his best. He looked composed. He looked like a man who had done his research and was confident in his position. He did not look at her when she entered. That deliberate not looking was its own kind of statement. She was shown to a table on the right. Calum sat behind her in the gallery, not at the table. She had told him she wanted to speak for herself. He had accepted this without argument. The proceedings opened with formalities she had prepared for. The presiding judge, a woman with iron-gray hair and an expression that suggested she had been administering nocturnal law for longer than most buildings in this city had been standing, introduced the case and its parties. She used the Voss name without particular emphasis, but Mara heard a shift in the gallery when it was said, a collective attention that had not been there a moment before. Victor's lawyers went first. They were competent. She had expected that. They presented the transaction from the Vane market as fully valid under nocturnal contract law, which it was, on its face. They cited precedents. They cited the terms of registration. They cited the completion of payment and the formal transfer of contract. They did not mention the covenant. Not once. Either they did not know about it, which was possible, or they had made a strategic decision not to raise it themselves, which was also possible. The presiding judge looked at Mara when Victor's lawyers finished. She asked if Mara wished to speak. Mara stood. She did not look at her notes. She had made a decision in the library the night before about how she intended to handle this. She was not going to argue like a lawyer. She was not trained for that, and the court would see through any imitation of it. She was going to say what was true, in the order that truth required, and let the documents say the rest. She said her name was Mara Voss. She said she was the daughter of Elaine Voss and the last living member of a family line that had maintained a covenant with the Dragici bloodline since 1683. She said she had become aware of this covenant recently and that she was here to invoke it formally before the court. The gallery did not make noise, but the quality of attention in the room changed perceptibly. Victor's lawyers stood immediately. The lead lawyer said that the covenant was not relevant to the matter before the court, which was a transaction dispute, and that invoking it was a procedural misdirection. The presiding judge told the lawyer to sit down. She looked at Mara and asked her to continue. Mara continued. She described the covenant in the terms Rhea had taught her, using the precise language the document used, the specific clauses, and the dates and the names of the signatories. She cited the clause that stated, "No member of the Voss family would ever be entered into any contract with any supernatural party without the explicit consent of both families." She stated that Victor Caldwell had entered her into the vein market without her consent, or the consent of the Dragici line, which was not a technical breach of the covenant, but a direct and unambiguous violation of one of its foundational terms. She paused. The room was very quiet. She said that the transaction from the vein market was therefore void under the terms of the covenant, as a completed transaction could not stand when the party entered into it had been protected by prior legal agreement at the time of entry. Victor's lead lawyer was on his feet again. He said the covenant was an antique document of uncertain legal standing. He said its relevance to modern nocturnal law was questionable at best. He said the court should not allow an unverified historical claim to overturn a completed and properly documented transaction. The presiding judge looked at the lawyer. She said the covenant he was describing was registered in the permanent nocturnal court archive, dated and authenticated, and carried full legal standing under every version of nocturnal law from 1683 to the present, including the current code. She said this with the calm of someone informing a person that the ground beneath their feet is in fact ground. Victor moved for the first time. She felt it rather than saw it, a shift at the table to her left, a physical adjustment that communicated something even at a distance. He leaned toward his lead lawyer and said something in a low voice. The lawyer nodded and then hesitated, which was the first sign of uncertainty she had seen from that table. The presiding judge asked Mara if she intended to invoke only the breach clause or whether she was invoking the full covenant. This was the question she had been waiting for. She said she was invoking the full covenant, including the dormancy exception. The gallery produced its first audible sound. Not dramatic, a collective shift, like wind through leaves. Because the people in this gallery, who had been following nocturnal law for lifetimes that dwarfed her own, understood what the dormancy exception meant in a way that Victor and his lawyers clearly did not. The presiding judge looked at her steadily. She asked if Mara was aware of what the dormancy exception required. Mara said she was. It required her to propose new terms before the court, which the court would then evaluate. The presiding judge said that was correct, and asked if she had prepared those terms. Mara said she had. She looked at her notebook, not because she needed to read from it, but because she had written the 3 terms in the notebook the night before, and she wanted to say them in exactly the words she had chosen. The first term she proposed was the most important. She said that the personhood of any member of the Voss family, including herself, would be recognized as fully their own under nocturnal law, non-transferable, non-inheritable, non-subject to nocturnal contract law, without their direct and revocable consent. This was a new term. The original covenant had implied it, but not stated it explicitly. She was making it explicit. The gallery was completely still. The second term she proposed was the consequence for Victor. She said that any individual found to have entered a covenant-protected person into a market transaction in violation of the covenant would be permanently stripped of all supernatural legal standing, including licenses, registrations, and access to nocturnal court proceedings. Victor's brokering work, his entire professional life in this world, had depended on his standing in nocturnal legal networks. She knew this. She had spent 6 weeks learning exactly what she would need to know. The third term she proposed was the most unusual. She said that the relationship between the Voss and Drugici families would no longer be governed by the traditional guardian model. Instead, the covenant would be renegotiated annually, with mutual consent required for its renewal, and with both parties free to modify or end it at any time without legal consequence. The covenant would be a living agreement, not a permanent obligation. The room was quiet for a long moment after she finished. The presiding judge looked at her. Then she looked at the 8 judges beside her. They exchanged a wordless communication that lasted several seconds. Victor's lead lawyer stood. He said that the proposed terms were unprecedented. He said that allowing a human party to restructure a centuries-old covenant on the floor of the court would set a precedent that the entire nocturnal legal framework was not equipped to handle. He said it at length and with evident conviction. The presiding judge let him finish. Then she said that unprecedented was not the same as impermissible. She said the dormancy exception was clear. She said the terms proposed by the heir were being evaluated on their merits. There was a recess. Mara sat at her table and looked at the high ceiling and breathed. Behind her, she could hear the gallery murmuring, low and constant. She did not turn around. After 40 minutes, the court reconvened. The presiding judge announced the court's decision. All 3 terms were ratified. The Vane market transaction was voided. Victor Caldwell's supernatural legal standing was revoked immediately and permanently. The Voss-Drugici covenant was formally renewed under the new terms. Victor did not react visibly. He was very still. His lawyers gathered their documents. None of them looked at Mara. She was still sitting at her table when the gallery emptied, when the judges departed, when the lawyers on both sides filtered out. She sat there because she had been sitting down for 3 hours, and now that it was over, her body had decided it needed a moment longer before it remembered how to move. She heard footsteps behind her, familiar ones. She knew the sound of him by now, the particular way he moved, unhurried and without hesitation. He came around the table and stood in front of her. He looked at her. He looked at the notebook open on the table. He said she had rewritten a 300-year-old covenant on the floor of the nocturnal court. She said yes. He said no one had ever done that before. She said she was aware. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had been watching nocturnal proceedings for a very long time, and that what she had done in the last 3 hours was among the most precise pieces of legal reasoning he had witnessed in any of those years. She looked at him. She thought about what he had said in the library, weeks ago, when she had asked him what the look in Vienna had been. He had said he was not yet certain how to answer that. She thought about the covenant she had just rewritten, the 3rd term in particular, the one that said the relationship between their families would be mutual, renewable, chosen. She said she was going to go visit her mother. She said Elaine needed to know she was all right, and that the hospital was the first place she was going when she left this building. He nodded. She said she would come back after. She said this clearly, without hesitation, the way she said things when she had decided them. He looked at her for a moment. He said he would make sure the East Wing room was kept as it was. She stood up, she picked up her notebook, she walked toward the courtroom doors. The stone corridor beyond was long and lit by narrow windows and cold in the way of very old buildings, and at the far end of it she could see the main doors, and beyond them the pale gray light of the outside world. She had walked into this world 3 days into a crisis with $43 and a broken shoe, and she was walking out of it with a rewritten covenant, a voided transaction, and a room in a house in the Carpathian Mountains that was being kept for her return. She thought about Petra Voss. She thought about the clause Petra had written in 1683 that had been waiting in an archive for 343 years for someone to find it. She thought about what it meant to write something down with enough precision and enough foresight that it was still useful to someone who had not yet been born. She thought about what she had written into the covenant that morning, the term about consent, the term about renewal, the term about choice. She pushed open the main doors. The outside air was cold. The city was gray and old, and full of stone buildings that had been standing for centuries. She walked out into it. She had things to do. She had her mother to see, and a life to begin rebuilding, and decisions to make about what kind of person she intended to be going forward, in a world she had not known existed a month ago, and was now, in some formal and documented and court-ratified sense, part of. She was not afraid. She had resources she had not finished discovering yet. She had a notebook full of things she had learned. She had a room in the mountains. She had chosen all of it. That, she thought, as she walked down the stone steps into the gray city light, was the part that mattered most. Not what had been done to her, or what had been decided for her, or what had been signed in blue ink on a document she had not been allowed to read before it was filed. Those things had happened. They were real. She was not going to pretend they were not. But she was still here, still thinking, and everything that came next was going to be chosen. She pulled her jacket around her and walked on,